why is India having to walk such a tightrope on the Ukraine-Russia issue? Because morally, even politically and diplomatically, it would seem that a country like India should have voted in favor of the resolution condemning Russia, because what Russia is doing in Ukraine is condemnable. And now increasingly it looks like they are not even succeeding in achieving what they had set out to. In fact, if anything, the latest meltdown that we saw from Vladimir Putin seems to tell us that he sees that he is inevitably going to face defeat. Today, he's got himself into a situation where if he wins militarily, he will still lose politically, diplomatically, and morally. You might say morally means nothing in hard geopolitics. That's okay. I'll grant you that. But the fact is that even politically, he will gain nothing, because Ukrainians, by resisting for this long, frankly, I've been surprised their resistance. On day one, information warfare was being won by the Russians, and the feeling was that Russians will roll over them and get into Kyiv. And I also made that mistake of saying that in my national interest, of presuming that Kyiv would capitulate at some time soon, but it hasn't happened as yet. And what the Ukrainians have done is they've bought time. They've bought time. So with the passage of every hour, Putin looks bad globally and Putin weakens internally in Russia, because he is a dictator. And as the history of all dictators tell us, that there are lots of people around them who are sullen, who follow their orders because they have no choice. But even if given a sliver of a chance, they will do something about it. Now, much as India might want to do this, India has some compulsions. And it's important for us to understand those compulsions. Since the nuclear deal, or since the first time that Vajpayee as India's Prime Minister and Clinton on the other side called India and the US strategic allies, that was about 24 years ago. We have deluded ourselves over the past 20 odd years into believing that given how much interaction we have with the Western world, particularly the US, our military and security dependence on Russia cannot be as much as it was, say, in the Soviet times. So I will give you some data and some facts to tell you militarily where do we stand. And all the data I give you, all the figures I give you, nothing of this is secret. All this is from public material. Public material is Military Balance, published by International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. SIPRI reports. SIPRI is the Swedish military bean counting institution, highly respected like IISS, and also from a report of the US Congress's Congressional Research Service. This is an October 2021 report, so fairly recent. So I will give you the numbers from these. Now you would presume from what I'm saying that the dependence of Indian military on Russian origin equipment is quite high. But how high? First of all, look at the Air Force. So Indian Air Force, if I look at the data from Congressional Research Service, that is a report of October 14, 2021, 71% of all of Indian Air Force's combat aircraft were of Russian origin, 71%. And this after, I would say, some Rafales would have come in by then. Now, maybe with 2 squadrons of Rafales, maybe it's a bit less, but maybe not, because India has also acquired more Sukhois. How do we cut the pie? If you look at the Indian Air Force, 71% combat aircraft Russian origin, of which 39% are Sukhoi 30, 22% MiG-21. I presume that number is a bit less by now, and the number of Sukhois has gone up. 9% is MiG-29. Once again, India is negotiating with the Russians now to try and buy up mothballed airframes for a bunch of maybe 2 squadron strength of MiG-29s. This is the dependence that Indian Air Force has on Russia. In fact, of all 3 services, Indian Air Force seems the most dependent. I will give you some more granular numbers. Sukhoi 30, 270 to 272 aircraft, depending on how you count. And looks like there is a bunch of them further on order or being negotiated. This makes 15 squadrons out of the 30 combat squadrons that Indian Air Force has. MiG-21 Bison, 4 squadrons. MiG-29, 3 squadrons. But just these fighting aircraft are not all that the Indian Air Force takes from Russia. If you look at Indian Air Force's larger transport fleet, now it is true that lately Indian Air Force has acquired C-17s and C-130s from the US, which have become the new workhorse. But there is also a large body of IL-76 Illusions. Those are aircraft that you see with cantilever wings, sort of wings that bend like this. So IL-76, they are large 4-engine aircraft. There are 17 of them, 17. That's a lot of transport aircraft of that size, military transport aircraft. 3 of these have been converted now or modified into AWACS, that is the Airborne Warning and Control Systems, right? So 17 of these. Again, if you look at mid-air refuelers, this is all the Air Force. Now, no modern Air Force can function without mid-air refueling. So Indian Air Force has 6 mid-air refueling aircraft. All 6 are of the Illusion series, IL-78. That's a further development on IL-76. Medium range transport fleet, 2-engine aircraft. It's almost at this point, almost exclusively of old Russian origin, Russian or Soviet origin. In fact, AN-32s. Now, AN-32 in the Soviet times was specially modified for the use of Indian Air Force. It's an AN-26 with engines that were drawn from the earlier heavier AN-12 aircraft. And if you see the picture, these are placed closer to the fuselage to give it more lift. So Indian Air Force could use these from the shorter strips in Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, etc., etc. So this was a kind of a bespoke transport aircraft designed for Indian Air Force. There is a large bunch of them. Many of them are not operational and they are waiting for upgrades. And there's a twist here. The twist is that the factory that makes these Antonovs, that stayed back in Ukraine. It's in Ukraine. In fact, you may have seen a statement from the Ukrainian ministers saying that the world's largest transport aircraft, which they proudly owned, AN-125, damaged in Russian bombing, right? It's called Myra, M-Y-I-R-A, which in Ukrainian means dream. Once again, this war has complicated things for India and particularly for Indian Air Force. Now, what is the situation with the other forces? If you look at the Army again is very dependent. And again, if I go back to CRS, and you will see the table from CRS. And if you see this table, you can see how India's purchases from Russia have gone up and down. The peak is between 2012 and 2013. I suspect that's when a lot of the Sukhois were bought. That's also when a lot of the BrahMos payments were made, because BrahMos missile also is in partnership with the Russian company. So it's a half and half partnership with the Russian companies. There again, there is a Russian dependence or Russian umbilical linkage. Now, if you see the Army and if you see its tanks, I would say that you could pretty much say that all of Indian Army's tank force is of Russian or Soviet origin, because many of these are T-72s which came in from Soviet times, and they've been reconditioned and they've been repaired and they've been upgraded and they are continuing on. But 66% all of Indian Army's tanks, 66% are T-72 M1s. Another 30% are T-90s. I will give you granular numbers also. Besides these, all that we have got is 2 regiments of MBT Arjun, which is sort of homemade, but that's only 2 regiments. It's heavy, it can only be used in certain areas, but it's 2 regiments out of so many. So maybe 3% of all of your tank force is of non-Russian origin. Everything else is. You want to see the numbers? So overall tank numbers, main battle tank numbers of Indian Army, there are estimates. I will not give you a precise number, but it's anywhere near 4,000 copies. And of the 4,000, nearly 3,880 are of Russian origin. That tells you how much dependence there is for spares, for ammunition, for upgrades, for all kinds of things. Then you look at infantry fighting vehicles, or what in the old times was called armored personnel carriers. Now they don't just carry personnel, they also have a gun, they have weapons, they have missiles, anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles. So they are now infantry fighting vehicles. Indian Army uses BMPs of Soviet and Russian origin. There is about 2,000 of them. All of them are of Russian and Soviet origin. All of them. So you can see the dependence that even the Indian Army has. And I told you about BrahMos, but also the new rifle that India is trying to make, the AK-203. That's also in joint venture and partnership between the Russian company and Ordnance Factories Board in India, which has now lately been corporatized. So you see a whole assortment of short-range surface-to-air missiles, that is Igla, Pechora, Tunguska, anti-aircraft system. All of these are of Russian/Soviet origin. And now the most important surface-to-air missile system that India is inducting is S-400, that all of us know a lot about, and we keep talking about it. So that is the state of the Indian Army and its dependence. Now, going back to the Air Force, and I'm going back because this is something that is common to Army, Navy, Air Force. Look at helicopters. Indian Army and Air Force share the fleets of Mi-17 helicopters. Mi-17 helicopters, also from Russia, now form the bulwark of the transport fleet, helicopter transport fleet of Army and the Air Force. There are a few Dhruvs and others coming in, but that will still take time. That is building up, and it's also building up slowly because HAL tends to not produce copies as fast as Indian Armed Forces would like them to. Then come to the Navy, and we'll come back to helicopters again, but we didn't talk about Navy's helicopters with Air Force and Army because those are different kinds of helicopters. If you look at the Navy, Navy has 10 kilo class submarines from Russia, Soviet Union. I qualify that because many of these came in Soviet era. So just to underline the point that many of these are not new either. And we have seen that a lot of these systems are not performing very well in Ukraine, particularly heavy armor, Air Force. You can see that Russian equipment is a little bit behind, more than a little bit behind the curve. Maybe they are ahead of the curve when it comes to nuclear weapons and hypersonic weapons, but conventional weapons, they are not behind the curve technologically, electronically. That is quite evident right now in Ukraine. Nevertheless, come back to the point. The Navy, 8 kilo class submarines, Russian Soviet origin. Vikramaditya, our only aircraft carrier. Vikramaditya is an original ship, Gorshkov, from the Soviet era. Gorshkov was the founder of the modern Soviet Navy. So this was named after him. It was converted, retrofitted, made into Vikramaditya. All the aircraft on that ship, these are MiG-29's carrier version. 43 of them, not all 43 operated at the same time from the ship. Don't get mistaken, but Indian Navy's entire fleet of combat jets, MiG-29s, is also from Russia. So that tells you the story of more dependence. Indian Navy is building 4 frigates right now, 4 Kriva class frigates. 2 are being built in Russia and 2 are being built in partnership in Goa at the Indian shipyard. That's a good thing. These are stealth frigates of Kriva class, as these are called, and thereby lies another twist. I told you that story about AN-32s, the Antonov plant having stayed back in Ukraine. So India also needs Ukraine to stabilize and for things to come to normal, because there is a dependence over AN-32s, which is a very large and important transport fleet, because a lot of the maintenance, particularly in Arunachal, etc., depends on AN-32s. But if you look at these frigates that are being built, those have an even more difficult twist. These frigates are Russian technology. Frigates are Russian origin. But the engine is made in Ukraine by a Ukrainian factory. Now, Russia and Ukraine have had a strained relation for some time. That's why it wasn't possible for Russians to get these engines shipped from Ukraine to them. So India went to Ukraine, India bought these engines and then brought them to the Russian dock where these frigates were being made. So these engines, again, Ukrainian, ships, Russian, once again a double complication. Then you see Kamovs. Kamovs is a whole range of different models of anti-submarine warfare helicopters that the Indian Air Force uses. Now, lately, an order has been placed with the Americans for about 30 helicopters that will do this job. But those will come in addition to the Kamovs that are there. In fact, at this point, India and Russia have also been negotiating on a joint production and research of more copies of Kamov helicopters. Then look at India's guided missile destroyers. Of the 10, 4 are Russians. Talwar class frigates, of the 17, 6 are Russian. So once again, the dependence on Russia is quite heavy. Not as heavy as Air Force and the Army, but that is also credit to the Navy. The Navy has stolen a march over the other two services in indigenizing, in designing and developing its own weapons at home. I'll just give you an idea of the deals which have lately been under negotiation. Because one, you might be wondering, how come I haven't talked about INS Chakra, the nuclear powered submarine that Indian Navy has had on lease from the Russians for a long time. And lately, another Chakra, which was a more later version from the Russians. This is an Akula class SSN, not SSBN. It does not carry nuclear weapons, but it runs on nuclear power, on a nuclear engine. That INS Chakra has gone back. That lease ended, it's gone back. I will share with you a story done by Snehesh Alex Philip, our defense editor. In fact, I owe a lot of the information on the basis of which and a lot of the wisdom that I'm sharing with you to him. So INS Chakra has gone back, but India is right now negotiating a $3 billion contract with the Russians for more Akulas to be made for India. It's a $3 billion contract. No other country in the world today will be willing to give us a nuclear powered submarine. See that AUKUS agreement whereby American technology will come via UK to Australia to make nuclear powered submarines. The first submarine won't be out before 2035 or so, but the Russians have been willing to do so, and that's why it's important. These Akulas were to be delivered by 2026. It's a $3 billion contract. Then AK-203 deal is $1.6 billion to make 7 lakh rifles. Kriva class frigates that I told you about with Ukrainian engines is a $2.5 billion deal. Then, and as I had also told you, negotiations are already on for a bunch of new Sukhoi 30 MK aircraft. It's about 18 aircraft. It's also a 700 million deal. Let us see. It's being negotiated. Let's see where it ends up. And there are also negotiations for 21 mothballed MiG-29 airframes, and then these will be retrofitted, etc. That also tells you the desperate straits that Indian Air Force is in, because its combat squadrons are declining and replenishment is not quite happening at the pace they may have wanted to. Particularly Tejas, they would like to get a lot more Tejas much faster than they are getting. Similarly, there are negotiations on for 10 Kamov 31. These are for all three services, anti-submarine warfare for 500 billion. That's going on. Kamov 226 also for the Navy. That's a $1 billion deal. So all of this is going on. Now you might be wondering, for how long has India been so dependent on Soviet/Russian weapon systems? So this wasn't the case until about, say, 1967-68. The India-Russia defense relationship came to fruition quite late, because 1947, when India became independent, to begin with, India did not have much money to buy weapon systems, but India had a bunch of sterling, that is pound sterling, which remained with the British, which the British owed us. Now, in exchange for that, they gave India a bunch of weapon systems. And that's how India got, for example, INS Vikrant, the first Vikrant. It was an earlier British Royal Navy ship, and many other things from Britain. We got our first Hunters from there. Among the systems Britain sold to India was the Centurion tank, which was Indian Army's mainstay in the 65 war and did very creditably against the Pakistani patterns. There was also Canberras, the bombers, all of these came mostly from Britain to begin with. In fact, almost all of the Indian Navy had come from Britain. Air Force had begun to diversify because the Air Force placed an order with the French very early on after independence. So they got the first lot of fighter aircraft from Dassault. These were Oregons, which were in India renamed the Tufanis. In 1961, India and Russia signed an agreement to jointly produce the MiG-21 in India. MiG-21 then was a hot aircraft system in the world. Russians produced it. The first copies came out in 1955, 56, 61. It was still seen as one of the best fighter aircraft in the world, very comparable with America's best at that point, which was F-104 Starfighter. But Russia at that point had a very close brotherly relationship with China. So while Russia was also diversifying in the mid-50s, Khrushchev and Bulganin came to India. When he came to India, he said that he supported India's stand, India's claims on Kashmir and also on Goa against Portuguese occupation. So that was the first time a superpower came and supported India on an issue of key importance for India. And that led to a warming between India and Soviet Union, which the Chinese were not happy about. So when the 62 war took place, Russia was neutral. And it is widely understood that Russia delayed the delivery of the first MiG-21s to India because they didn't want to annoy the Chinese. But another couple of years subsequently, the distance between China and Soviet Union grew. It grew to an extent that by 1963, 64, Indian Air Force began to get some MiG-21s. But again, the supply was so slow yet that when the 65 war broke out, and 65 war broke out later in 65, in September, Indian Air Force still did not have a fully functional operational squadron of MiG-21s. It had about 9 MiG-21s at that point. The pilots were also not yet fully trained, tactics not fully developed. And remember, just to underline to you, that first lot of MiG-21s just had 2 missiles, 2 of those early generation missiles. They did not have a front cannon or a gun with which to chase another fighter aircraft and fire. Those modifications came out much later. So this was the first big breakthrough in the India-Soviet Union military relations. In fact, when the war with the Chinese took place, the countries that came to India's aid were the Western countries led by the Americans. And the truth is that if Nehru and Kennedy had not died in quick succession, it is quite possible that the larger direction of India's strategic policy might have been different at that point. Nevertheless, what happened. 65, the war took place. Russia by this time had become influential in the subcontinent. So Russia brokered the Tashkent summit and also leaned on Lal Bahadur Shastri to sign that agreement, that peace agreement with the Pakistanis that obviously Shastri wasn't happy about. And we know what happened then. Shastri ji passed away, Indira Gandhi took over. After that, India-Russia defense partnership became even closer because by this time the British had also pulled away and India desperately needed hardware. And 65 was an incomplete war. So everybody knew that something was going to happen to complete that war. And that is when 66, 67, 68, India began to get the larger supplies of Russian aircraft, lots of MiGs, for example, AN-12s, and also tanks. So T-55s then came to constitute most of the main battle tank force of Indian armored corps. There were some Vijayantas also, but they were really not frontline MBTs at any point of time. It was the T-55s. 71 war was fought with T-55s, with MiG-21s predominantly, Sukhoi 7s in ground attack role. Also, the Navy had the Russian missile boats, the Osa class. Remember the ones that carried out the raid on Karachi? So by this time, India-Soviet defense partnership had become quite deep and it has carried on since then. Now the fact is that could India have started this process of distancing or diversifying earlier than it did? Most certainly it should have. And that's where UPA 2 is at fault to begin with, because they signed the nuclear deal in UPA 1, but after that got so punch drunk and they ran into so many internal problems and so much internal resistance that they just kept ordering more and more from the Soviet Union. So India's Soviet dependence actually became greater in that period. Modi government also now, it's the eighth year. They've also not been able to diversify as much as India should have done by now. So what's happening right now between Russia and Ukraine, and what's happening right now with the global opposition and sanctions on Russia, is a big moment of truth for India's military and strategic planners. Ultimately, the solution is to be Atmanirbhar. It is to produce everything indigenously as possible, but that will take a great deal of time. And even if you become indigenous, a lot of the stuff, a lot of the samagri inside will come from outside. For example, if you look at MBT Arjun, the engine comes from Germany. If you look at the helicopters that HAL is making, engines are coming from overseas. Tejas engine comes from the US. So all these things will take time to unfold and roll out. But India has to now fast forward that process now. Any dependence on one power is very, very dangerous. And that is what is tying India's hands right now. Because with the Chinese sitting on our borders, they can ratchet it up anytime they feel like. Another summer is coming now. In that situation, do we want to have any disadvantage regarding the maintenance, resupply of ammunition, resupply of attrition on our Russian origin equipment?